Can you imagine a nation where your morning cup of coffee costs more than your car? Or a place where wheelbarrows are used to transport money instead of goods? A country that was once hailed as the jewel of Africa could plummet into economic despair, leading to astronomical hyperinflation and a currency so worthless it was often cheaper to use it as wallpaper. This is not a fantasy, but the stark reality of Zimbabwe, a nation that once held great promise but found itself in the throes of one of the worst economic crises in history. Our story begins in the heart of southern Africa, where the nation of Zimbabwe emerged from the struggles of colonialism. As a former British colony known as Rhodesia, it was once celebrated for its fertile land and rich resources. However, it was also marked by a tumultuous history of conflict and oppression. In 1980, Zimbabwe gained its independence, and the world watched with hope as the country's first leader, Robert Mugabe, promised a bright future for his people. At the outset, Zimbabwe seemed poised for prosperity, but the road ahead would be far more challenging than anyone could have imagined. The turning point in Zimbabwe's economic downfall came with the controversial land reforms of the early 2000s. Mugabe's government implemented a program of land redistribution, seizing white-owned commercial farms and distributing them to landless black Zimbabweans. While this move was intended to correct historical injustices, it triggered a devastating economic crisis. The sudden and chaotic seizure of productive farms crippled the country's agricultural sector. Once known as the breadbasket of Africa, Zimbabwe soon faced severe food shortages, hyperinflation, and mass unemployment. The Zimbabwean dollar, once a symbol of stability, became nearly worthless. In the scorching July of 2003, in a nondescript Zimbabwean general hospital in the third-largest city, something strange unfolded. Security officers on a routine patrol stumbled upon a peculiar scene: a person, oddly returning a corpse to the morgue. Intrigued and slightly disturbed, they decided to investigate further. What they uncovered was a dark secret hidden in the hospital's bowels. The mortician and his assistant were not merely preparing the deceased for their final rest, they were renting them out. This wasn't the work of morbid curiosity. It was born out of sheer desperation. Ordinary people had been driven to this bizarre practice, but their motivation was far from what you might expect. They were desperate for a vital resource: gasoline. In a desperate attempt to secure gasoline in a nation where wait times at gas stations stretched for not just minutes, but days, these individuals took on disguises as hearse drivers. They exploited a government policy that allowed hearse vehicles to bypass the long queues at fuel stations, ensuring their share of the nation's dwindling fuel supply. But this chilling side business and its increasing demand wasn't just an oddity in Zimbabwe's history. It was a clear symptom of a country teetering on the brink of economic collapse. Once upon a time, Zimbabwe was one of Africa's wealthiest and most advanced nations. However, by the time 2009 rolled around, it was clear that the country's modern economy had unraveled. Schools that had once been the pride of African education now saw students using dusty floors as notepads. Zimbabwe, once an electricity exporter, was plunged into prolonged blackouts, with power becoming the exception, not the norm. A nation that had been hailed as the breadbasket of Africa for its agricultural industry was now grappling with starvation and an astonishing 94% unemployment rate. But perhaps the most shocking testament to the country's dire situation was its mind-boggling inflation. Prices didn't merely rise. The currency itself became worthless. Inflation skyrocketed to an unfathomable 89.7 sextillion%, after which it stopped being recorded because the numbers became meaningless. Almost all companies collapsed, life savings evaporated, and desperate people resorted to bartering for survival, an activity that could get them arrested. But how did a nation with so much promise implode so devastatingly? Zimbabwe's economic journey is a harrowing tale of the critical role global strategies play in shaping a nation's destiny. Now let's rewind the clock to 1865, when two Dutch settlers bought what seemed like ordinary farmland in South Africa. Within a few years, their land had turned into the world's richest diamond mine, known as the Big Hole, controlled by British-born mining magnate Cecil Rhodes. This marked the birth of De Beers, now the world's largest diamond company. Rhodes, not content with his mining monopoly in South Africa, founded the British South Africa Company in 1889. Armed with a royal charter, they invaded Mashonaland and initiated a brutal military campaign against the Ndebele Kingdom. This conquered land became known as Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes himself, and later split into southern Rhodesia, which now makes up Zimbabwe. Over the next 3 decades, the British South Africa Company had control over the land, extracting its resources to the fullest. However, they overestimated the mineral wealth of the region and had to pivot. They started promoting European migration and nurtured a white rural elite to accelerate economic growth. This new approach was intended to increase tax revenues, rail system profits, and land values. Between 1902 and 1911, the European population doubled as people flocked to strike it rich in mining, but it was the farmers who benefited the most. The fertile land was ideal for cultivating crops like corn, cotton, wheat, and tobacco. These farmers became incredibly wealthy and powerful, successfully persuading the British government to grant Southern Rhodesia semi-autonomous status in 1923. Under this arrangement, Britain managed foreign policy, while the white minority controlled internal affairs. With their newfound autonomy, they established an apartheid state, prohibiting black citizens from owning fertile land and confining them to regions with drought-prone conditions. In contrast, Europeans, who constituted only 2% of the population, were allocated over 70% of the prime land. As post-World War II economic growth surged, the white minority's grip on power began to wane. To maintain their dominance, Southern Rhodesia declared unilateral independence from the British Empire in 1965, a move unrecognized by most international governments. However, they managed to stabilize the economy with secret trade alliances, keeping the economy growing even as they faced global isolation. The black population waged a 15-year bush war against the government with the support of external powers. The war resulted in the end of white minority rule, birthing the new nation of Zimbabwe in 1980. This marked a momentous occasion, and many hoped for a prosperous future. Zimbabwe quickly became the darling of the international community, with a seemingly moderate Robert Mugabe at the helm. The education system thrived, healthcare centers multiplied, and the economy saw steady growth. Agriculture, post-war peace, and Mugabe's decision to keep the white farming class intact made Zimbabwe the breadbasket of Africa. However, beneath this facade of progress lurked disturbing political violence, corruption, and economic mismanagement. In 1981, Mugabe enlisted North Korean military instructors to train an elite brigade, the Gaikarahunde. This brigade systematically targeted political rivals, leading to the deaths of thousands. Mugabe, as his power grew, enacted economic policies that aimed to control every aspect of the nation's economic life. Legislation made it nearly impossible to fire workers, leading to hesitation in hiring. This stifled labor-intensive industries and saw the growth of state-owned enterprises controlled by Mugabe loyalists. By the time Zimbabwe was starting to see economic reforms pay off, the War Veterans Compensation Fund ran dry due to corruption, leading to protests and a sharp economic downturn. Zimbabwe's debt increased, leading to rampant inflation. In 2009, Zimbabwe abandoned its currency, and foreign currencies stepped in to replace it. International aid flowed back in, and the economy briefly saw growth. However, this was short-lived. In 2013, Mugabe doubled the civil service and started printing new bond notes. Economic collapse followed in 2016. In 2017, Mugabe was ousted, but his successor, Emmerson Mnangagwa, has mirrored many of Mugabe's missteps. The devastating lesson from Zimbabwe's tragic journey is that leaders with unchecked power can be as destructive as any external enemy. The story of Zimbabwe serves as a poignant reminder of the dangers of autocracy and how power can be wielded to the detriment of a nation and its people. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Zimbabwe's turbulent history. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep smiling.